Well, good morning. Please sit down. I was going to say thank you for that very kind introduction, but I shouldn't be too surprised. I helped write it, so I heard a famous person get introduced like that before, and he said, which is a line I've tried to steal, but I haven't quite mastered it yet. And it said, "Thank you for that very kind invitation or introduction. My father would have been proud, and my mother would have believed you." So since I first arrived from Canada almost 40 years ago now, I've been involved in investment banking. And for the first 26 years of that career, I was involved in the cold, hard commercial space. And I worked for banks like Macquarie Bank and a group called Babcock & Brown, which some of you looking at the age in the crowd might remember. It was famous for the wrong reasons. But I did have a number of wonderful experiences. I was involved in buying a company called AIDC, Australian Industry Development Corporation, which is about a $10 billion balance sheet from the Commonwealth government. I was involved in aggregating about 12,000 retirement units and putting them into a fund that we then listed with aged care as well. And I spent some time working in Ireland, actually we're in the UK and Ireland, on the €5 billion acquisition of Eircom, which is Ireland's Telstra. So throughout this time period, I began to understand through great sort of teaching and leadership that my purpose was to release funds for the kingdom. And at the time, that meant kind of maximizing my earnings, I thought, and then my wife and I could see how much of that we could give away, which was fun and challenging. It's hard to give away well, I think. And then, of course, in the GFC, which some of you will remember of 2008, it all came crashing down. The company I was working for at the time, Babcock & Brown, went broke, and much of the value of what we'd accumulated for the poor went up in smoke. And my wife was very wise, and she said, look, when I first came home after finally being retrenched, which I'd been trying for some months, and she said, no, I genuinely had been trying to get out. And she said, look, we're going to take a piece of time and we're going to mourn the loss of the wealth. Because we watched our share price go from $36.50 to $7.50 to 50 cents to zero. And we had, we'd had a number of shares, but they were pegged for the poor in our mind. And she said, look, we're just going to allow ourselves to mourn the loss, and when we're done, we're going to go back. And I thought, oh, that's really sweet, honey. Yeah, we'll do that. But actually, it was very freeing. She's very wise. And I remember railing at God, going, what were you thinking? And realized that wasn't very smart. So I pulled back a bit and said, okay, well, what were you thinking? But it was a traumatic and a confusing period. But ultimately, I think I'm very grateful for having gone through it. So finding myself as an ex-investment banker is obviously quite sobering, because you realize you don't know everything. And I decided that I wasn't very good at anything other than banking, and that kind of narrowed down the choices. I've been involved with Opportunity International, which is a global microfinance group that's faith-based, and it sort of sets entrepreneurs free by giving them small amounts of money to build very micro businesses all around the world. That company now has about 6 million clients in India predominantly and in Southeast Asia. I decided that if I wasn't good at anything but banking, then I should stay in banking but change. So I ended up staying in banking but doing it in the social sector. So for the last 12 or 14 years, I've been working, pulling together, doing exactly the same, pulling together financing transactions, generally large asset-based transactions, and financing them, but for the social sector. So mainly in the areas of affordable housing, aged care, disability accommodation, domestic violence shelters. And I was speaking with Ron. Where's Ron? Anyway, he works for an organization that we actually brushed with, and I was very impressed with. And so that's in the area of addiction accommodation and also transitional housing. So among the other things we've been able to do and had fun doing, we helped community housing providers finance about 2,600 affordable dwellings over the time. And I also was very privileged to be involved in a reviewing of the Australian Foreign Aid Program to work out whether investment could be used as a tool for foreign aid, and if it is, what were the costs and risks associated with it. So over that time, I was quite confused when the crash happened, because I thought my purpose was making money and giving it away, but that wasn't quite what I was called to. I was called to releasing funds for the kingdom. And what I've discovered since then is that really I can do more by gathering institutional money, large capital, and applying it into situations that are aligned with the kingdom values. I can do way more by gathering other people's money than I ever could by limiting it to what I could earn and then give away. So we do that as well, but it's really, I feel like my purpose is much clearer now, because it's about, rustling up tens or hundreds of millions of dollars rather than paltry amounts that I could earn. Now, by way of introduction, I thought I would save the best for last. I have but one wife, Philippa. We've been married 38 years. She's a very patient woman. And we have 3 adult children. Well, actually 6, because they're all married. And we have 3 delightful grandchildren. And some of them I should say hi to on Zoom, because they didn't want to come halfway across the city to be with me, but they're hopefully watching. And so my wife was going to be here to share with you, but we went up to Brisbane on Thursday for the third of 3 big fundraising dinners for this Tekoro operation in Uganda on Friday night. And so on Friday morning, she had a bit of a sniffle and tested and came down with COVID. So I didn't. I went to the event, had this beautiful dinner, came back, she was still in the hotel. And then we suddenly thought, okay, well, how are we going to get home? Because she can't fly, and we're not staying here for a week. And so we ended up renting a car and driving from the 1,000 kilometers yesterday from Brisbane to Sydney to be with you this morning. So Philippa's gift to you this morning is that she's not sharing COVID with you. Yeah. So the first thing I wanted to talk about today is growth. And all living things grow, right? Everything that is alive grows. And all things go through different stages as they grow. And this is all common sense, right? We see caterpillars to chrysalis to butterfly to eggs to caterpillar and so forth, cycles. We see tidy lawns, with all the rain and the warm weather, suddenly become furry hedges and completely overgrown, and like everything grows, right? And growth is so natural that we only actually notice it when it doesn't happen, when we get stuck at a particular age or in a particular stage. And every parent stresses, especially new parents, stress that their child is actually keeping up with the stage they're supposed to be at. Like, is he supposed to be walking or doing solids yet, or should they be sleeping through it? And we compare our growth phases to other people about what normality is. But also, we really only notice it when it's lacking. We notice it when, if an adult can't read, for example, or if a teenager isn't toilet trained. That's a bit bad image. But I'm going to repeat that again tonight and see if I get a different response. But it also looks strange when a man dates a woman who's his daughter's age, right? You should grow up, right? And the Christian walk is no different. And Jesus calls you ever higher, always further. Our church has a next step program, which is wherever you are in your journey, there's always a next step. So try and figure out what it is and how you get engaged and how you get involved, how you begin to learn, how you begin to lead all the way through. And Paul refers to this in 1 Corinthians 13:11 when he says, when I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. I'm going to get a little esoteric here for a moment, so bear with me. But I'm going to talk about Soren Kierkegaard. So he was a great Danish theologian and Christian philosopher from the mid-1800s. And he identifies 3 stages of maturity in the believer. And I hope you'll forgive my butchered attempt at explaining it. But the first stage he calls the aesthetic. And it's the most immature stage. We approach God on a surface level only. We're saved, but we're still leading this shallow existence living for fleeting natural desires and emotional fixes. And we're living by impulse. We seek momentary, immediate happiness in career, social life, and material possessions, and I would say in church experiences. We're the first up the altar, and trying to get saved for the 5th time, and it's an emotional response rather than whatever can come next. At this stage, our opinions are often borrowed rather than thought through or argued out with God. And often we're still hedging our bets, right? 1 foot in and 1 foot out, just in case this doesn't work out. I'm going to keep my friends in the world so that I can always go back. The second stage, Kierkegaard calls the ethical. And this is where we progress to a position of morality and duty to set aside your own desires and take up responsibility. We understand that the aesthetic lifestyle leads to bondage, while true freedom is found in pursuing things of eternal value. We have a higher moral aim, and the ethical person demonstrates persistence, moral clarity, and sacrifice for the greater good. And you might call that person kind of principled responsibility, you might describe them. But ultimately, the ethical begins to rely on a moral code and an ethical framework, the law. Their work leads them to become self-reliant, not reliant on the personal power of God. And the good works system grows and begins to crowd God out. So Kierkegaard's third stage is called the spiritual. He calls it the spiritual. So the law is good, but it's not alive. It cannot intoxicate. In this third stage, we must look to God himself. He takes us above the law to a place where faith and grace and intimate relationship and perspective. Each stage doesn't reject the previous ones, but builds on them, adding depth and substance as we grow. So the law of the ethical isn't rejected, it gets fulfilled. We can have the new and keep the best parts of the old. For spiritual stage Christian givers, our gifts can, once again, become an expression of sheer gratitude and worship. The acts of obedience that do more for the giver than the receiver. We're no longer a donor, no longer a benefactor. We're making a statement about the world and the God who created it through our giving. Let's look a little bit more at one of the characteristics of this third stage of Christian giving. In Matthew 13, Jesus tells a parable about a sower of the seed. The seed gets widely scattered and falls on a variety of ground. You know the story, rocky, thorny, a good ground. It sounds a bit messy and it sounds a bit wasteful, but that's because the scattering approach that sows the seed. So generous scattering, because the sower isn't trying to pick which ground is successful or not, they just put it out there and let God choose whether that lands on rocky or stony or good soil. And they know that the reward for the good soil, 30, 60, 90 times, will cover all the wastage on the rest, all the notional wastage on the rest. Look, in this parable, Jesus is referring to the sharing of the gospel, but I think the principle extends to our financial generosity as well. In fact, in Luke 6, Jesus calls us to be generous to everyone, even or maybe especially to those who hate us. And we might put that first one up there, please. I'll start reading and we'll catch up. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting it to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. Oh, and giving means you become children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. In the parable of the sower, The sower is called to be generous, extravagant, boldly generous, every direction, scattering the seed widely and without prejudging what the effect might be. Actually, just thinking about this, maybe Miles won't be that happy I'm telling everybody to give widely rather than just to the church, but that's okay. We'll live. I'm not encouraging this as an investment plan, incidentally, although it's pretty much exactly what angel investors or venture capital does. They don't try to pick winners. They screen out some of them, but they just scatter money everywhere knowing that the 30, 60, 90 return is going to get there. But as a giving plan, I think it's got merit. Let's have a look at these verses that fall just before that Luke passage we just looked at and try to see them in a new light. This is Luke 6, 27 to 31. So this is just before what Jesus was saying. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. And then 7 verses later, Jesus says, give and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. For the measure you use will be the measure used to you. Maybe Paul was thinking about along these same lines when he wrote those verses that we heard just a little bit earlier with Sanjeev, 2 Corinthians 9, verses 8 to 11. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all you need, you will abound in every good work. As it is written, they have freely scattered their gifts to the poor. Their righteousness endures forever. That's a cool saying. As it is written, they have freely scattered their gifts to the poor. Their righteousness endures forever. How'd you like your righteousness to endure forever? That kind of thing. Now, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion, and through your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. So the call seems to be use a big scoop and scatter widely, right? Trust the Lord of the harvest to generate the return on your scattering and to replenish your seed. Now, I know all of us want to learn how to be generous. But generosity does not start with a need. It doesn't occur when you come across something that needs to happen. It starts with a life of openness. Okay, so to put another angle on Kierkegaard's stages of development, come with me, please, to the story of the Prodigal Son, which might sound a bit funny, but we're going to look at him in Luke 15. Now, it's a great story. It's something that everyone can relate to, right? We've got a wayward son. We've got a petulant older brother. We've got a loving father. And it's like, I don't know, when you guys hear Jesus' parables, I always try to put myself in one of usually the complimentary bit, right? I'm usually the good guy in the story. But let me read this to you again. It's going to, pardon me as we read a lot here, but I ask you to shift your perspective. Let me ask you to consider what this familiar story can teach us about financial resources. So Luke 15, 11 to 32. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided the property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together everything he had and set off for a distant country and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, love this verse, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servant, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the oldest son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So the father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Now let's have a look at some of the characters. The younger son, he's unreliable, self-centered, emotional, impulsive, impetuous. The son took his inheritance and squandered it for his pleasure on himself. And here you see the father's love confronting and contrasting the younger son with his selfishness, which was the selfishness of excess consumption. But if we look at the older son, he too got it wrong, right? He was wealthy, but he lived like a slave. He was blessed, but not generous. You might think of him as responsible, but maybe not really. He was bound up by wealth and burdened by the fear of true responsibility. He made a virtue of self-sacrifice, but he allowed that to turn into self-righteousness. The father also confronts this older son with his selfishness, but this time it's the selfishness of accumulation. Do you note the remarkable similarity to Kierkegaard's stages of maturity? We have the aesthetic, immature, impulsive, emotional, driven by the experiential, and we have the ethical, proper, conservative, and moral, but legalism causes him to lose touch with love and generosity. So let's then turn to the father. Let me share something with you that a great friend of mine pointed out. We won't go back and read it again on the screen, but in verse 22 it says, but the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him, put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Now the robe and the ring, as I'm sure you know, are symbols of sonship. Their authority to manage the estate. It's like the internet banking password and credit card, or like for the older crew, it's like the checkbook, right? Then we see the father's statement to the older brother in verse 31, and it says, my son, the father said, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But hang on, he just gave it away to the younger son again. So the question is, what happened to the missing half, the half that the son blew and came back and shared again, right? So here's the thing. He essentially said, the father essentially said the same thing to two sons. You own this estate. Is this time to leave the stage? Is that like the Oscars? He essentially said the same thing to both sons. You own the estate. The father knew that in this estate, his estate, where both sons wear the ring of authority, the resources are unlimited. They're not limited like we know. The father also knows that the blessing of inheritance comes with responsibility, and responsibility means accountability for my actions, not my brother's. And the responsibility of running the estate is meant to be rewarding and not a burden to be avoided. Finally, the father knows better than anyone that everything the sons have is inherited. Their birthright arises through membership in the father's family, not through anything they did, notwithstanding the older brother's attempt to earn it. So what is the father really saying in this parable? He says to the younger son, grow up. I've restored you to a position of authority. I forgive you and I trust you. Now take what you've been given and be responsible. Don't squander it. Don't consume it. I trust you. Act like me. To the older brother, he says, grow up. Welcome him back. His restoration, his blessing's not going to hurt you. You can afford to be generous. There's more than enough to go around. See it from my perspective. Think like me. Because the younger son needed his actions changed, but the older brother needed his thinking changed, right? And to both he's saying, be grown-ups. Take responsibility. Think about what's needed. Think about the right thing to do. Think and act like the heir to the estate that you are. Think and act like me. So for today's purposes, I'd like to summarize those instructions as think like an owner. So ownership, as you know, is very different from tenancy. And my wife and I have been renting a house out for a number of years. And we came back and moved in, and there's a bunch of things to do. And my wife in particular is very good at noticing things. I tend to gloss over them, but everything from, the shutters, blades need crack, the paint scuffed, the tiles need whatever. But the list, if you own a place, goes on forever, right? You never actually outgrow the responsibility for the ownership of the estate by letting it deteriorate. You grow into that, and it goes forever. And so what I want to do is, so the Ephesians 2:10 verse that we heard actually earlier, for we are God's handiwork, created in advance to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. So maintenance around the estate is constant and feels never ending, but that's what comes with the joy and responsibility of ownership. So as we draw to a close now, I urge each of you to answer the following two questions for yourselves. Number one is, how would thinking like an owner change the way I see the estate that I've inherited, this world around us? Things like, how would it affect my view of pollution or waste? How should it affect the way I see social justice or poverty or need? And the second question is, how will thinking like an owner change the way I look at the financial resources that have been entrusted to me? How would it affect the ratio between what I consume and what I give? How would it affect my commitment to looking after those in need? And how would I adjust my priorities? So how do we wrap this up? God continually calls us to a higher plane of maturity and generosity. That growth is constant. He wants us to grow up to see from his perspective, and he wants each of us to think like an owner, because that's what we are. As we finish now, I'm hoping that there are people here who are challenged by what I've said. And maybe you'd like some help in moving to the next step of your Christian walk, maybe especially in this area of giving or in handling money. So I want to invite you, if that's you, I invite you to stand where you are and allow me to pray with you. Is that all right? Can we do that? How about we now, if you'd like God to lead you in this area of giving, please stand up and we'll pray together. Great. Thank you, Father, for these men and women who desire to know you better, who hunger and thirst to go deeper with you and to embrace more of your ways. Speak to them, Lord, through your word, and bring life-changing revelation as they dive in to seek out truth. Father, let your Holy Spirit fall on each one of them. Let your peace be with them as you guide them in your ways. And all God's people said, amen. Thank you. If any of these ideas are brand new to you, or maybe the whole Jesus thing is still kind of uncertain in your mind, I urge you to move the decision from your brain to your heart, that thumping heart that you're feeling right now. So when the service is over and when Sanjeev or Ben takes over, I invite you, come down here, talk to these people, let them help you find the words to invite Jesus in. And then you're on the journey, and it's an amazing journey. So thank you very much for this morning.